but we are hopeful that we'll be doing either some smaller events later on in the year. And I wanted to announce too, if you haven't seen, we are planning on doing our annual conference on December 8th and 9th. And it's going to be a combination of some part online and some part in person, if it's safe. We'll be following COVID protocols and watching the trends. So, but please hold those dates. We're going to be doing some smaller events leading up to that as well. And Global Washington is about creating community here within the global development practitioners. So we hope to do that again in person. So the topic today is water and peace building. And this really does represent what Global Washington is really about. Really thinking about a human-centered approach to global development, and also thinking about the greater impact of interventions. We do use the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework, which lays out 17 different goals, and such as clean water and no hunger and climate action. However, we also say, think outside that SDG box. Think about the cross-cutting implications. And when you think about water and peace building, it's a great topic to really think about how things intersect. And again, like I said, the impact that one intervention could have on a greater community. So we're really here today to think about how water projects can create more community cohesion and bring people together. I am thrilled and honored to have three fantastic speakers that are really experts in this topic. We'll have a moderated conversation first, and then we'd love to bring in the audience members. We'll do that through the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen. We'd like you to type in questions there. And if you could wait until about 10:50, because the panelists might answer your question during the moderated conversation first. But type in your question there, and we'll have the panelists verbally answer those questions, and I'll be facilitating that Q&A. We are recording today, so just wanted to let you know that. And again, if you've just joined us, type in your name and affiliation. Make sure it goes to panelists and attendees, so that we can, again, start to create that community of who cares about this issue today. So I'm going to do a brief introduction, but I encourage all of you to read the speakers' full bios and find out more about their organizations. First, we have Dr. Aisha Juman, who is the president of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. Aisha has a PhD in epidemiology and a master's in public health. She's also worked in the past for the CDC in vaccination programs and other roles covering immunization, cancer prevention, nutrition, and substance abuse. She was the director for the HPV vaccine program at PATH, and she's been an assistant professor at Emory University and Sana'an University in Yemen, and she's worked in her native home country of Yemen with the UNFPA, UNDP, USAID, Save the Children, and the Dutch Embassy. So welcome, Aisha. Next, we have Caitlin McGarvey, who is the North American Fundraising Manager for World Vision. Caitlin has a master's in laws degree for water law and policy from the University of Dundee in Scotland, and a master's degree in peace and conflict studies from Uppsala University in Sweden. So obviously the intersection of those two degrees is perfect for this conversation today on water and conflict resolution. Prior to her current role, she was the WASH and Economic Empowerment Sector Coordinator at World Vision USA. She has also worked in Southeast Asia, the Nile Basin, Uganda, and India, and she was in the Peace Corps in the Philippines. Welcome, Caitlin. Our third speaker today is Kate Riley, who's the Executive Director and founder of Ever Village. Kate is actually an environmental engineer at heart, but she also works and focuses at the intersection between social and environmental issues. Her organization, Ever Village, promotes green infrastructure installations in low and middle income countries for sustainable futures. Prior to Ever Village, Kate has worked as a water program coordinator in Mexico and designed urban ag programs for children in Southern California. And she's done community engagement in Snohomish Conservation District here. She has a master's degree in public policy from UW and a master's in environment and environmental health engineering from Montana State University. She believes that the nature-based solutions that we can do to support local leadership and livelihoods and the welfare of overall populations. So welcome, Kate. So the first question I want to pose to all of you, just to give us some context about what we're talking about with this topic, is I want to ask each of you to give an example of how your organization and their water programs or WASH programs have been instrumental in peace building. Aisha, we're going to start with you.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and it's an honor to be with all of you. I don't know, but I think the majority of you know, Yemen has been going through unfortunate war that started in March 2015, and that has created the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, unfortunately. And the war destroyed a lot of the water and sanitation and health services in Yemen. Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation decided that water is going to be one of our major priorities because of its intersection with both health and food security. We are a mostly volunteer organization, and we depend on local people in Yemen to carry out our work. And for our water project, and most of our activities actually, we use data that's published by UN agencies to identify the areas that are most in need. And then we use our extensive network of volunteers to work in the different areas because these people know the local context more than anybody else. And given that it is a war, they also can navigate the political and the conflict hurdles that come when you're delivering aid, because everybody thinks that you're spying for the other side. So we have 3 main water-related projects, and I would like to share just pictures of some of our work, and as I talk about them. Okay, can you see the picture? Oh, perfect. So this is our first water project in which we distribute water filters to IDP camps. This picture here is in an internally displaced population camp. There are about 4 million people in Yemen who are internally displaced. And water sources in Yemen, unfortunately, right now are all, come from, water holes that impact the population's health. So we have about 2.3 suspected cholera cases in Yemen. And we've sent about 5,000 water filters. Each water filter can clean about 5 gallons of water per hour. And these are, again, distributed based on where we see cholera rate is higher. The second one is what we do is also we do water tanks. So this is a water tank that we had made, and we put them in neighborhoods where there is no water at all, or very close to areas also where IDPs are. And we truck in water to these tanks. A lot of the water responsibility, unfortunately, falls on children because they either have to walk for hours or wait in line for hours. And so we decided by bringing water to the populations that these kids will be able to attend schools and not stay waiting for water or walking for hours. And this is one of our criteria, is an area where people would have to walk over an hour to get water. And we also make sure that they are cleaned periodically. The third one is what we call water purification using renewable energy. This is a project that is funded by the Humanitarian Grant Challenge Canada, and we are working with engineers in San Diego. So this system purifies about 100,000 gallons of water, and it was built specifically for Yemen. So when I was in Yemen, and we are going to mount them in 3 different hospitals in Hodeidah, one of the most affected by infectious diseases in Yemen, including cholera. And when I was in Yemen, talking to the health office, this is the director of the health office in Hodeidah, I realized that the water in Hodeidah is actually salty. And so we had to redesign the system that now it also desalinates water. And it is 100% using renewable energy. And so that these are the 3 main projects that we have for water. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Those are great photos too to show. It's good to get some context in that way. Thank you so much. Caitlin, I'm going to turn to you next. Can you give a specific example of a World Vision project as it relates to water and peace building?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Kristen. It's great to be here with you all and to share a little bit about this work. While World Vision is a rather large NGO, we really take a localized approach to water, sanitation, and hygiene services. And so we do this by working with local communities, local governments, NGOs on the ground, and we have 1,200 local WASH staff embedded into the communities who are living and working there. And so that really provides us with a localized context of what's going on and ensuring that the programs that we're implementing meet the needs of that specific community. And so when we talk about peace building, obviously you can talk about large scale conflict or large scale peace initiatives, but it's really important also to look at peace building at the local level and with the most vulnerable communities. So World Vision emphasizes reaching the world's most vulnerable, especially with WASH services. 30 of the countries that we work in are fragile or extremely fragile. And then within those countries, it tends to be women that are disproportionately impacted by the global water crisis. So on average, women globally spend about 200 million hours a day getting water. So that's on average, a woman or a girl walks about 6 kilometers to get water. But then you also know that women are dealing with children who are sick from waterborne illnesses, and also women their lives are at risk when they give birth in healthcare facilities that lack water resources. So in the areas that World Vision works, only 50% of the healthcare facilities have access to clean water, and about 85% are lacking any type of safe hand washing facility. So all of these things threaten the ability for women to have fulfilled lives in the sense that they can gain an education, take leadership roles in their community, be involved politically, or develop businesses, and really design the life that they want to build. And so if we don't have these opportunities, we don't have a positive peace in the communities where people are able to live a well life. And so it's really important to address this relationship with women and better integrate women into WASH services and design WASH services that meet their unique needs. And so we're doing that, one, through provision of WASH services at healthcare facilities, like I said, to help women who are giving childbirth, to give them a safer experience. We're doing this by including girls in WASH committees at their schools, WASH clubs at their schools. We're also ensuring hygiene education for girls and boys at schools to understand the unique needs that women and girls face. And we're providing sex-specific latrines at schools to help girls so that they can go to school when they're on their period rather than staying back at their homes and missing out on education. But one of the things that really excites me about our work with women is that World Vision really takes an approach of trying to find the most sustainable WASH mechanisms for each community. And they do this by creating water associations in the communities that we work. And these associations are community members that are responsible for water management decision-making around these projects. And also they manage the fee collections, or the collected fees that people pay for the water services with, in order to reinvest those fees into rebuilding anything that breaks down and helping further develop and innovate the water systems to better meet the needs of the public. And World Vision emphasizes having about 50% of those seats filled by women. So 50% of the Water User Association members should be women in order to articulate and represent the needs of the entire community. Because without that representation, people are left behind. And so it's really important to do that. And we know that this has an impact, not only on the leadership roles women can take in the community and their confidence in finding a voice, but we've also seen that this actually leads to more sustainable water projects, which is incredibly important as we're dealing with water security issues in conflict zones, as we're dealing with climate change, and as we're dealing with greater water scarcity. And so we know this through a UNC evaluation funded by the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. And UNC evaluated our boreholes and hand pumps and found that about 80% of them were still functioning 20 years after they were created, compared to up to 50% for other hand pumps from other organizations or other government entities. And so we said, why is that? Why do we have 80% success rates? And so the question, we did a follow-up evaluation and found in the areas where the hand pumps and boreholes are still functioning, it's where women have a greater representation on these water user associations. And so we can make the linkage between the inclusion of women in more fulfilled societies where everyone has a seat at the table and also has better access to water. And so I'm really interested in that partnership between the local empowerment of women through water user associations and the impact that has on the broader community. So when we talk about peace building, that's where I like to start, just at the local foundational level of making sure everyone in the community has representation and has a seat.
That's great. That's so interesting. I hadn't heard about that study and approach in terms of women taking the leadership. It actually reminds me of microcredit. That's what as you know, that's what they found with microcredit, of lending to women. They invest in the family and it was more sustainable for the long term. So
yeah,
it shouldn't be a surprise that that's what's happening with water associations too.
Yeah, and it's actually very connected to some of the savings groups that World Vision and Vision Fund do, because with the fee collection systems, it is sort of embedding savings groups and savings group mentality and learning into the community. So it is the first step for then that layer of economic empowerment that comes afterwards.
That's great. That's so great, and really important to recognize women's role in this, both in the burden and in the solution. So thank you for that. Kate, I want to turn to you now. Can you again give an example, and maybe within that you can talk a little bit more about EverVillage and your model?
Yeah. So we're really trying to take an expanded approach to WASH, as so many of us in the international development community are seeing groundwater and our aquifers really being challenged. So, the boreholes and the wells that we're drilling are very quickly going dry. And so we're really trying to think about how we utilize nature-based solutions to help get water back into the ground and help communities see that as an asset. And so our one example that we have that's been really interesting lately is in the Kurdistan region of Iraq with the Syrian refugee community. And for many years, I think so many of us were hoping that it would be temporary, but it's now becoming a permanent settlement, like many of our refugee communities. And so, with roads and more housing, and you can imagine, and it's no longer kind of in a shotgun approach to like, let's get housing immediately, but there can be some planning involved, especially between the host community, the host Iraqi community, and the Syrian refugees. And so what came about this kind of collaborative community planning was that they really wanted green space. And that's what I love about green infrastructure, is that it's this multi-benefit solution where we can create habitat, we can create shade in the desert, we can create all of these things while managing water, while creating that space to, infiltrate water over flooding, for example, and then putting it back into the aquifer. So that's what I think has been so interesting, is, you know, I think a lot of us in the water field have always felt like, gosh, it's the scarcity and the true scarcity of water left in the world that is leading to conflict. But I think we're trying to change our mindset of that water can be like this amazing tool to build trust. Um, and I think we've seen that in the Middle East, you know, with the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Jordanians. You know, they still haven't haven't, you know, solved all the conflicts, but like having these neutral things and such an elemental thing as water to be a source of that trust building is huge. And I just think it's so powerful. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much opportunity in water. And I think that, as you know, it can literally, like, you know, make green spaces for all of our kids to come to. And I think, like Caitlin was saying, when we can work at the local level and start expanding that out to, you know, transboundary and all of the much larger kind of political issues that we need to talk about water management, it's just going to get that much meaningful and that much more impactful.
That's great. It's really important to think about green spaces as not just for the beauty of it, but the essential, as you said, the nature-based solution for sustainability and the welfare of people, the mental and community welfare. So I love that approach. I think that's really great. Great. Aisha, I want to turn back to you as well. You talked about this a little bit in terms of the war and the impact on the water systems there, but can you talk about that a little bit more and perhaps talk a little bit about a path forward from here after the war?
Thank you. So the consequences of the lack of water, clean water and sanitation has had a huge impact on the population. We talk about violence a lot of times in terms of wars, but violence also is impacting a person's health. So when someone is malnourished, when someone is experiencing famine, when someone is experiencing disease, I consider that violent against the population, especially when they are related to man-made causes. So for the water-related issues, in terms of war and conflict, I'll talk about it in Yemen in 2 points. One, as it relates to water and sanitation and the impact on population's health from that. And then I'll also talk about it from water for agriculture, which looks into food security. Because of the war, we've had a major destruction of the infrastructure in Yemen, both health and water and sanitation. As such, we have, of the 13 million people in Yemen today, about 15.4 million people in Yemen who lack access to water and sanitation. And that has resulted in multiple health outcomes that have impacted, and I would say had violent impact on population's health. So we know, based on UN data, there are about 20 million people in Yemen who have no access to health services today. And then we also know that there are 2.3 million Yemeni children who are suffering from malnutrition. Of these, 400,000 Yemeni children are, based on UN data, have months to live if they are not taken care of. We also have, as I said earlier, 2.3 million suspected cholera cases, over 100,000 suspected dengue cases. These are all related to water availability. We also have a vicious cycle of poor water and sanitation, infectious diseases, and malnutrition. They all feed into one another. And then we also have the other issue, and that's why we have our water projects in the hospitals, is that we also have healthcare-associated infections. Healthcare facilities in Yemen, most of them lack access to clean water and sanitation. We also know many of them lack access to soap and water for hand washing as well. In the world of COVID-19, when people were asking communities to, clean your hands with water and soap for 10 seconds or 30 seconds, my heart sank because I realized that's not is going to be available to the majority of the Yemeni population. And sure enough, there was a survey that looked into access to soap, a bar of soap. 54% of the people who were surveyed said they couldn't afford a bar of soap. So all of this has had, again, a lot of impact on the health of the Yemeni population. We know there are at least, this is the very conservative estimate, about 130,000 Yemeni people who've died to these causes that I just mentioned. Looking at it from a food security aspect, Yemen already was suffering from severe water shortages, and this is true in many areas as well. But we also, on top of that, we have lack of fuel due to the blockade. And that has threatened agriculture quite a bit in Yemen because people are no longer able to water their produce, and many of them die before they're able to harvest them. And because of the food insecurity, and Yemen imports 90% of its food and needs, which is quite a bit. We have 16.2 million people in Yemen who are today food insecure. We have over 1 million Yemeni women who are anemic, and we have another over 1 million Yemeni women who are suffering from acute malnutrition. Of course, and Caitlin talked about this a bit, is women carry the burden of most of the work. And so you have anemic women, you have malnourished women, and they also, that makes them at high risk of death while giving birth. And so, and women again carry the burden because they need to provide water and food to their families, and both are not available. So that has been some of, I would say, the violent acts of lack of access on the Yemeni population. In terms of how do we see a way out of this, there've been a lot of interest in, especially with the food insecurity in the Yemeni population now, to look at agriculture again, because they were importing food that was cheaper than planting it. And now more people are starting to think, no, we need to start doing that. The irrigation, the new irrigation systems that use water wisely is something that people are looking at as well. I have a friend, his name is Mukhtar Khanshali. He was the one featured in the book, The Monk of Mocha. He is now in Yemen. He's doing an assessment of areas where they can grow coffee. I don't know if you know, but through whenever coffee is tested in international competitions, Yemeni coffee always gets the highest marks. The last time was in Japan, and it got 98%. So he's looking into areas, doing an assessment of areas where coffee traditionally grew. And he is also interested in reviving the coffee plantations in Yemen. And these usually are small plots that are owned by individuals. Once he has that assessment, he and I are going to be collaborating, or Yemen Relief and his organization, where we will be supporting farmers to plant their coffee trees. But we also are looking into other ways. For example, we support orphans and Green Space, Kate. These orphanages have a lot of areas because they are usually walled in, and they have a lot of space that's not being used. So we've been working with orphanages to support planting vegetables in these areas, in their own yards. And so I think there is a lot of interest now. People understand the value of agriculture, and also with the new technology, Now for water pumping, people are using solar panels because, again, of the blockade and lack of fuel. So, and I also have to report here because Sana'a is probably now the greenest city in the world, with probably over 60% of the population using solar panels for electricity. So in the midst of all this heartaches and pain, people are learning new ways. And so I'm hopeful that that would bring us into a better space and place.
Thank you for that. It's so heartening to hear the hope through all of this. Again, we've heard a lot of the dire situation, the crisis that's ongoing, but it's wonderful to hear that especially your foundation is working on these things, and that really thinking about this topic in clean water, that it's not just clean access to clean drinking water, it's local food production, it's prevention of all the other diseases. And I do think people realize a little bit more now with COVID, as you mentioned, people recommending around the world to washing hands. And then even when COVID, they realized that it was more airborne, the idea of clean water in hospitals, the lack thereof in so many hospitals around the world is such a critical need. So I'm hoping that people are understanding the value of water in different ways because of this heightened awareness, and the stories of hope coming out of Yemen definitely helps with that. So thank you for that. Caitlin, I want to turn to you too. Can you talk a little bit more about World Vision's WASH programs and just the critical role that they're playing in peace building?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. And I want to echo a lot of what Aisha and Kate are saying about how water can be used, both in terms of conflict and in terms of cooperation. So, I mean, water can be a weapon of war, it can be a trigger for conflict, it can be a casualty of conflict, right? So those are the relationships that water can have with conflict, but it can also be an instrument of peace building. And there's this concept in water management known as PCCP, which is looking at water in the framework of potential conflict to cooperation potential. So how do we reframe our understanding of water in these fragile and vulnerable contexts where it has traditionally been seen either as a weapon or a trigger or a casualty of conflict? And I think one of the things that World Vision has seen that's really exciting is we've seen the ability to use WASH programming for peace building and as a cooperative tool. And one example that we have coming out of Jordan about this is a Work for Water program that's been funded through a German counterpart. And, this echoes what Kate mentioned about the Syrian refugee crisis and just the influx of refugees in Jordan, which is a relatively small host community and already in a water scarce environment. And so while Jordanians and Syrians tend to be friendly, we also noticed increased tensions between the host community and the new refugee community within Jordan over these scarce resources. And so this Work for Water program employs 9,000 people, half of them Jordanian host community members and half of them new Syrian community members, to work together to rehabilitate water systems that have been damaged, primarily dams. And so we're seeing this program pull in the knowledge and the technicality expertise, and also just the time and commitment from both of these communities to collaborate on building better water infrastructure for their now shared community. And that's bridging relationships between these communities and what used to be, a little bit tense. We see this in other contexts as well, including with children, right? And so one of the examples I was really excited to read about was coming out of Chad, where there's traditionally conflict between herding and grazing communities, right? Or herding and farming communities. Chad is, again, a very water scarce region. And so when you have herders who are trying to graze their cattle and farmers who are trying to irrigate their crops, you tend to see a lot of tension over the water resources for these areas. And then also sometimes the cattle may graze the crops that the farmers are growing. And so this can actually lead to violent conflict between these communities. And so one of the things that World Vision was doing was working with kids camps to teach wash services to children. So this is, again, sanitation and hygiene, washing your hands, disposing of waste, just basic principles like that. And it was for children from both of these communities. And then through the children, their families started interacting, and they were forced to sort of to interact and see each other, and the children became friends. And so that opened up dialogue between the families. And I think one of the things we need to remember when we talk about this is we want instant peace, right? We want to go directly from conflict to peace overnight. And that's not how things work. It takes time. It's a transformational process. And so, in this example in Chad, where you have these communities, the children are there building the bridges, and the families are starting to, understand each other a little bit better and work out agreements and some cooperative frameworks around, water resources and also grazing. But it doesn't change overnight. And so it does take a lot of time. And it probably will take a lot of time because these are generational tensions. And then, of course, I want to also echo, this isn't something that only happens in silos. It's not, we don't see water being a tool for peace building only in a certain context or a certain country. We see it globally. So we see examples in Latin America where our wash work is providing people with the water that they need to irrigate farmland and build the economy that they need, the income sources they need, so that they don't have to migrate north to the US. And again, we may not see, a declaration of war on our border, but we do see this causing tension and conflict at a political scale, at a social scale. And so if we're able to help communities thrive where they're at and help invest in those communities so that they have the resources they need in order to find that positive peace that Aisha is talking about, where they do have access to healthcare and well-being and food and livelihood and all of these other things, then there's less likelihood of migration and tensions, socio-political tensions between countries and between different groups of people. And so I think that's a really exciting thing. And then, again, at the local scale, if you have water scarcity, you can see people fighting over limited water resources at a borehole or something like that. And so again, that's where these water user associations come in to help ensure that everything is functioning in a sustainable way so that water scarcity isn't triggering person-to-person conflict. So again, you see it from the most local level to the international level, and you see it across regions and geographies, which I think is really exciting.
That's really interesting. I mean, again, it makes sense that it's a universal aspect and universal need. So it's really good to hear. And I'm starting to hear some very common approaches that are successful from all of you. Again, it really centering on local ownership, local governance, local input into how for sustainable long term. So Kate, I wanted to turn to you to see if you can talk about that a little bit more. I know Ever Village works in Peru, so could you talk a little bit more about the power of your water management system that you're using in Peru with the people there?
Yeah. And, kind of just thinking about what Aisha and Caitlin were saying, I also feel really positive. I feel like the paradigm is shifting a little bit, especially in Latin America, where we had a history of water privatization and Nestle going in there, and unfortunately most recently it's kind of big ag buying wells, and then it was just kind of mayhem, so then people felt really threatened. They were protesting, and there was a real lack of enforcement and regulation from the municipalities and the government side. And I think that's what I really see changing, especially in Latin America, because I think that we all have realized the collaboration that's going to be needed to solve the long-term water crisis. And so that's been really heartening to see in Peru. The cities kind of realizing that the indigenous populations are at the headwaters, you know, so they need to be supported so that there's enough water getting down to the city. So that rural urban boundary is really crucial, I think, in the next couple of years, you know, decade or so. But in Peru, at a small village that has definite long-term water goals, you know, like being able to bring back their alpacas to, you know, sustain their historic weavings and livelihoods of their women. They, you know, they have ancient practices of that kind of, you know, they match like the best engineering that we have today. It's stunning, and we've seen this in Jordan. We've seen this with so many indigenous cultures, and I think that there's certainly more awareness from our side. You know, we hear this, like, you know, matching the ancient with the new innovation, and there's so much potential there with water. It's really exciting. And so in Peru, they kind of have an ancient practice of what they call it planting the water. It's essentially in a holistic plan, you know, there would be very specific places in the mountain where you would actually, you know, put the water back into the aquifer. And so, you know, I see kind of the conventional Western engineers kind of letting the, you know, the villages play with that a little bit more, and providing, in this case, you know, we didn't get any money from the government, but we definitely got in kind. So we got a lot of machinery, we got a lot of their labor, which in turn is like this kind of co-learning that Caitlin was talking about. Like, we're all in the field trying to solve this problem together. That's really cool. And so, yeah, I'm just really looking to a future where we can just continue to keep working on these watersheds, because I do, well, we don't really have a choice, I guess, but I do think it's a solvable issue.
That's great. And it's wonderful you said that engineers are starting to recognize indigenous knowledge in this. I do think it probably takes an engineer that is open-minded about that, such as yourself. I think, you know, a lot of my experience is engineers have a solution and they're going to go in and implement it. And then maybe that's the old frame, but it's really great to hear people like you and others that are really recognizing, again, the indigenous knowledge and the solution in all of this. So that's great. So I have one more question for each of the speakers, but now is the time for the audience also to start thinking about questions. Go ahead and start typing in questions in that Q&A tab, not the chat box, but the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen. So as I mentioned before, it is wonderful. It sounds like all of you are fairly hopeful for the future. And you've mentioned this even in this greatest challenge that we have right now worldwide. But I want you to drill into that a little bit more. Why are you hopeful? And if you could think about it within this path forward, within this hopeful future, is there something you would prioritize for everyone to think about? But think about it. And if you're a little pessimistic about certain things, let us know that as well in this last question. Aisha, I'll start with you. What are you thinking for the future?
Yeah, again, I think my being hopeful is just being in contact with people that we work with, whether it's our volunteers or the population we serve, and knowing that how they're very creative in resolving problems and coming up with local solutions. So that has been extremely heartwarming to see that. And there is, then within even a country, there is so much diversity. So Yemen has some of the highest mountains in the Middle East. We also have the seashore areas, and we see how people are focusing on solutions that affect their local areas. For example, in Hadida, as I said, because the water there is salty, there are small desalination services, and some of them are actually owned by women. There is also a lot more women now who own solar businesses, solar panel businesses. There is a lot more interest in training even on solar panels. And there are times when they actually make them locally because they're not able to get them through the blockade in Yemen. So just to see how that innovation in providing solutions for themselves has been very good. And I think especially with young people, I communicate with a lot of young people. And, when I was in Yemen the last time, I met with this young man who developed a drill for water that cost less than $4,000, when actually drills normally, cost about $30,000. So there's a lot more innovation. There's a lot more local solution. The other thing that is very important, and again, because even within Yemen, the diversity is that culturally appropriate solutions. And I loved what Kate said, is we need to learn from the local people. Even as a Yemeni American, I cannot go to Yemen and tell people, hey, I have a solution for you. I actually have to sit down and listen to them and see first of all, what is the problem that they are trying to solve? Most of the time we consider global problems to be local problems as well. So, and that's not necessarily true. So what we consider, for example, a global problem in some areas, that's not true. So I think listening to the local population, understanding for them what their priorities are, and then once we identify their priorities and what have they done to deal with this issue? And then once we identify that, are there anything that we can inject in that will help them? So if we see that the use of water for planting, for example, is used as excessive water, we can't talk about irrigation methods that can conserve water. I was approached by someone, for example, and Mukhtar as well, was approached by a funding agency that wanted to give him $3 million to do coffee planting in areas that don't, traditionally in Yemen, they didn't grow coffee. There is a reason for that. They didn't grow coffee because coffee doesn't grow there. Coffee doesn't do well there. Yet this donor insisted that, Mukhtar takes the $3 million, and Mukhtar said, sorry, I'm not going to take your money. And because these areas, just coffee is not going to grow here. So again, identifying, really working with the locals and gaining from their experience, their expertise. I mean, we're talking about populations that lived for thousands of years. And they have, the wisdom and the knowledge to teach us. And so I would advocate for, again, hearing them, working with them, and making sure that we're not introducing something that would have a negative impact on the local population.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, again, it's so critical. And I think it's been acknowledged in the global development community, but it's taking time, I think, to really take hold and take root. And those of you that have, staff in country and understand the dynamics there, I think do better, right? With having, again, working directly with local people and having, rather than having solutions come from Seattle, just flying in and dropping there. So I am hopeful for that. Just in the broader global development community, I think that change is happening as well. Caitlin, I want to turn to you too. Are you hopeful for the future? And can you talk a little bit about why?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm dog sitting and she's just a puppy, and so she's here. So I have one arm playing with her and my mouth talking to you, and my brain engaging in what Aisha and Kate are saying. I tend to be as a person, I tend to be a little more pessimistic about things. You know, I'm a pessimistic realist, I believe. And I think it's interesting because I approach this both from the position of a researcher through my previous research, and then also as a practitioner through my work with World Vision and Vision Fund. And, you know, climate change is very real and it's very much on our doorstep. And I mean, beyond our doorstep, it is our house. And that's going to further complicate political relationships and conflict as a whole, and then two, water security and water issues and natural resources in general. And so the combination of those complications from a research perspective makes me think we're going to see additional instances of conflict either over freshwater resources or where freshwater resources are threatened as a result of conflict. And we are seeing more prolonged and protracted conflict. However, I am hopeful through, as Aisha said, the practical parts of our work where we do get to engage with communities and see the innovations that are coming from around the world. And I think sometimes the US just needs to catch up. I think one of the things that really excites me is when you look at peace and conflict research, you see that durable peace is attained with the inclusion of diverse groups, right? Indigenous representation at the mediation or negotiation table, women, people living with disabilities of some sort. So you need that representation. And I think that's something that really excites me is we now have research, we have data, the global community has realized that the inclusion of these groups at local level water management is impactful in terms of water sustainability. So now it's a matter of elevating this research and this knowledge to the transboundary and international levels so that we can see the inclusion of more women in particular in transboundary water management decisions. I think, you know, there's a lot that's exciting. There's a lot that we've talked about that is really optimistic. And I do think overall, we're going to move in a good direction. I mean, we're ending the global water crisis. More and more people are having access to water. Access to improved sanitation, more and more people are having, you know, improved livelihoods because of that access. More and more people are getting household connections. More and more people are having improved health because of this. So I do think we're on a good trajectory. And I think what we need to do is take these local learnings and magnify them at national and international policy level. So I definitely think that's exciting. And one thing Aisha mentioned COVID and the lack of soap and the cost of soap. And I think that's one thing that we need to remember is, you know, we are just coming out of this pandemic. And while it's a disease, you know, it's not interpersonal conflict or state violence or one-sided violence or anything. It is something that causes a lot of tension in communities and is violence against people's well-being, right? And so one of the things that I think was exciting with World Vision is we saw, okay, this problem and this time of need actually presents a good opportunity to expand our WASH services. So whereas it might have been more difficult to get investors and donors and governments to focus on the sanitation and hygiene components of our work, they all wanted access to water, but maybe it was harder to get them to focus on sanitation and hygiene. Because of the problem of COVID, there was a lot more investment and infusion of resources into this sector. And so we did see huge improvements in access to hand washing and hygiene and sanitation this year. So I look at conflict in the same way that, yes, it's a global need. There's a global problem, climate change, conflict. But when people are sort of unified around that common concern, there is great mobility and power that people possess to unify around solutions. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So overall, I am very optimistic. And I think doing this work day to day, I mean, you get more stories of optimism than you do of a challenge. So I think that's a wonderful thing.
That's great. That's a great way to frame it. I picked up on two things of really thinking about a bottom-up approach rather than top-down approach of taking the local solutions and local proof points and creating global learning from that and really taking advantage of this crisis, if you will, in terms of COVID to really have people understand WASH in a different way. So that's really, really good points. Thank you. Kate, I want to turn to you. Are you hopeful for the future? What are you seeing in your work?
I am, and I can't, articulate any better than Caitlin and Aisha really have, I think, with the priorities that they mentioned. And to me, the only other thing to say is really that long-term water management needs patient capital. It's a long-term game that we're playing, and so really trying to figure out those financial mechanisms. And I know that we as funders and we as grantees, this is a big conversation among us. But I think that, yeah, the shotgun approach we know doesn't work. And I think just as we are into a recovery from COVID and into climate change, that we really do that in a thoughtful way. And that really starts with our financial mechanisms as well.
That's great. And you and Caitlin have both mentioned climate change, and Global Washington's really been looking at the topic and what we're calling, climate justice. And Kate, it is what you've been talking about in terms of the global environment of looking at Indigenous knowledge and the disproportionate impact climate change is going to have on Indigenous populations in low and middle income countries, and how their historic knowledge can be part of the solution. So definitely looking at climate justice as a piece of all of this, really, really important. So, well, this is great. We've got a couple of questions from the audience too that I want to turn to. One from Marianne Mercer, who asked if any of the panelists you can talk about what's something that the interested public can do to promote a better understanding of the global water crisis, and are there any national or international efforts that need public support? So does anyone want to jump in? Aisha, go ahead.
I'll use this opportunity to say, at least for Yemen, to be on the healing path and start, all the things that they need to do to rebuild, is that we need to stop the war. And I say that in this context because the U.S. government is supporting the war. And so if there's anything that the public can impress on this administration, that we are very hopeful will, support peace efforts in Yemen, I'd like to ask for that now.
And Aisha, if you want to explain a little bit more, do you think that is effective to go through your local representative, the Washington State delegation in the Senate and Congress, or how do you think people should communicate?
So actually, we need to do it at all levels. So we need to do it at our representatives in Congress and the Senate here in the state of Washington. We can also write to State Department. We can also write to the White House. I haven't been trying to write to the White House the last 4 years, but I'm now finally happy to remember the number again so I can call. So it's actually at all levels. And there are a lot of great organizations that are working on this. We are a member of about 400 organizations that are working to push for peace and for the U.S. to be an impartial mediator, because at this point in time, we haven't seen evidence that they are impartial. They're actually part of the coalition that is at war in Yemen. And so the more they hear from us as citizens that we want the U.S. government to be impartial and to support peace in Yemen, the more likely Yemen is going to start in the road to the healing process.
That's great. Thank you for that. It's such a critical point, and something, again, everyone can do as an average citizen as well. Kate, anything to add, Caitlin?
Yeah. Well, I think one, I want to answer this question on two levels. One, I will gladly share a resource to an event World Vision has coming up. It's called the Global 6K for Water, and it's on May 22nd. And this is something you can mobilize your communities to do. And it's a great way to sort of build public awareness and advocacy with your own friends and neighborhood and family members So I'll share that link. And the reason it's a 6K is because that's the average distance that women and girls walk to get water in communities where they don't have access. So instantly you're putting yourself in that position, or the position of those women and girls, to sort of feel what that looks like. But then also it mobilizes attention and publicity about the water crisis. So I can share that resource. And then I would say, also look in your local communities, because we've talked about local so many times on this call. But, we are here, and we have our own water inequity issues in the United States, and we have our own water scarcity issues in the United States. And so there's plenty of organizations in our own communities, and you can advocate to learn more and better understand your community's water issues, through your town hall, city council, and then also local nonprofits. So I'll share the link for the Global 6K for World Vision, but I also want to help us all understand that we're all interconnected in this crisis. So what we do here impacts people in other countries, and the people that we've been sharing, the stories that we've been sharing, it's all interconnected, and we are one global society. So we can do a lot here as well.
That's great. Is the 6K like a competitive race you have to run with?
You can walk if you want. Yeah,
Okay,
you can walk, you can crawl, you can do whatever you need to do, stroll, rollerblade. But with it, you'll also be the funds that are raised through the Global 6K will obviously support women and children and addressing the water crisis.
That's great. It is a good way to think about how even your physical movement, and I love the 6K analogy of the average length a woman has to go to get water. So that's great. Kate, anything to add to that question? Okay, we can move on. We've got another one too. There's a question from Catherine Dirksen. First, she says, thank you for the powerful stories from all of you in different places. She asked, is there a sense that clean water availability is getting worse or better on the whole? And it seems that more people are dying daily from water scarcity or waterborne diseases. And are women walking farther or longer? And if it's getting worse, is this because of climate policy, et cetera? Does anyone, and you can localize it into a specific context, because I'm sure you'll need to. Does anyone want to answer that?
I can do my best to take a start if no one else. Aisha or Kate, do you prefer to? Okay.
I will go ahead first, Caitlin, and then I'll follow you.
Okay, please, because I don't know if I can answer all of these, all the components of this question. So Catherine, thanks for your question. I saw your message about the 200 million hours and whether or not that's increasing or decreasing. And the truth is, I don't know. So I need to look for new research since that study has come out. But I know from a WASH perspective, in terms of access to water resources, we are, we're almost there. So the global community is committed to ensuring everyone has access to water and sanitation by 2030. I think we're much closer in terms of access to water. There's still a big gap for sanitation, at least improved sanitation. And so I think that's where attention will focus next, because even if you have access to clean water, if you're still spreading waterborne illnesses through poor sanitation management, then you're still struggling. So I do need to check on that, but my thought would be it is dwindling as people are getting access to clean water. Clean water availability is an interesting question because it looks so different in every context. So climate change can threaten the access to clean water, at least freshwater resources. We are seeing in some contexts an increase, I think Aisha mentioned this, of salination in our water. And Kate mentioned aquifers. So as aquifers are drying in a lot of coastal communities, sometimes salt water can start to seep into those aquifers, and that contaminates freshwater resources. Additionally, just in certain communities that are prone to more drought, we're seeing less water. We're seeing more variable rainfall. So it's harder for people to capture and protect the clean water they are getting in communities that are dependent on that rain-fed water system or in rainwater for their freshwater needs. But we're also seeing a lot of innovations, right? So we're seeing a lot of solutions to address all of these issues. So as a whole, I'm not sure where it would stand in terms of overall availability, but I know if we don't take action to protect the resources we have, and if we don't keep innovating, then it is going to be a serious threat. So, you know, it is a very vulnerable resource. It is a fragile resource, and it is a finite resource. And so we need to make sure that we are protecting the limited amounts of fresh water that we do have, because it's not abundant. So.
Asia, you want to add to that?
Yeah. So, and I'll speak in the context of Yemen. We've had a growth in population, quite a bit, and then we also, so that made fresh water not available, or not readily available for this overgrowth of population. The second part of it is our modern way of living. So traditional Yemeni ways, they were always conserved water. And there's actually a proverb in Yemen that says, don't waste water, even if you're at the sea. So, and the sea means you have so much access to water. But unfortunately, our modern day lives, we don't think about conserving water. And the other thing that became very prevalent in Yemen before the war was swimming pools in these mountainous areas. And that again, I was horrified actually when somebody took me to show me their swimming pool in their home. I'm like, water is already scarce, and now you're adding to this. It really is a waste of water, to be honest. So yes, I think we have mismanaged how we are using water. And we also had a population growth, so water became scarce. That is one of the issues. And then you had the war, where we had a major destruction of water services and sanitation services that has led to an explosion of infectious diseases in Yemen. We've had outbreaks that Yemen had not had, since 1980. So in terms of the health indicators in Yemen, I did an analysis in 2016 to look at the impact of the war on Yemen on health. And we found that Yemen had dropped to 10 years back. So the health indicators in 2016 were similar to what they were 10 years ago. Now we are 6+ years of the war. And I've been looking at health indicators, and Yemen had lost about 30 years of advancement in the health indicators. And water is at the central place for a lot of this, whether, as I said, whether it's in health or whether it's in water, in food security issues. So yes, I think we are, unless we start thinking differently, unless we realize that, like Caitlin said, this is not an infinite source. We need to be to come with productive ways that conserves water. And for Yemen, I think go back to using water as if it's a very precious commodity. That's how I grew up with water. It's very precious, and we need to teach that back to especially the new generations.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And Kate, you can add to that, but I actually have a different question, Kate, quickly. So I'll ask you this, and you can either answer this question or the previous one. What do you think about installing kind of green water systems in places such as refugee camps? That we know now that many of the refugee camps were meant to be temporary, and they become semi-permanent, or there's at least children growing up for 20 years within a refugee camp. So how are you thinking about water systems in terms of green installations in places such as refugee camps?
Yeah. And just maybe to tie it back to the last question, that, yes, the WASH data looks great, but we don't have much data on those leave no one behind communities like many of our refugees. And so we definitely need to know more about especially communities that are in transition, or communities that are, doing active mitigation or adaptation. Like, now's the time to really study so that we can start to replicate things that work, and kind of modify things that don't work. But I think what I've seen in the refugee world is just kind of the cookie cutter approach, of homes of a certain size and roofing that works. And we're trying to do these pilots. So maybe, one section of, one plot where we're doing rainwater catchment, and we're trying to configure it in very limited space, but that it begins to become very easy to build and, resistant. And so that's been a bit of a challenge, just because, materials are limited, and change is always hard, kind of back to our engineering mindset. It has been a bit of a challenge to try these new techniques. So water catchment at the individual level, Aisha also showed some amazing pictures. That's huge, because you're actually putting the control into the individual residents' hands, which in a place where they have very little control. And then we haven't talked a lot about wastewater, but there's so many amazing green techniques to actually deal with wastewater, which is another issue that we see in so many of the developing and humanitarian, environments. It's just, it's just the water coming down the road, the dirty water, that's adding to some of the issues that Aisha has seen as well. And so, constructed wetlands, things like that, where it's like you're literally creating greenery and having plants and soil clean wastewater, and that becoming a community asset. So, like, to your question, it's a bit of a change. It's a change in mindset, because we as engineers, we were brought up a different way. Like, we were brought up to get the water, dirty water, off the land as quickly as possible. But we actually need that water. Like Aisha's saying, like, even if it's wastewater, it is precious. We've got to figure out a way to close that loop. Like, that's a key part of the theory behind green infrastructure.
That's really interesting. And Caitlin, I know World Vision works obviously with refugees around the world too. Do you have any thoughts around this too, or with internally displaced peoples?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting because our work is changing rapidly, right, year over year, because we are seeing more migration, we're seeing more IDPs, we're seeing more, like I said, prolonged and protracted conflicts, which means people are living in unstable situations for a longer period of time, whether it's in a refugee camp or temporary housing. And so World Vision is really trying to figure out the balance between, in the past with, an emergency response, you could provide water tanks, so you could provide something that wasn't necessarily a sustainable water source. But now we need to, because communities are being established around these refugee settlements or IDP settlements. And so we're working with local communities and local water authorities to figure out the best solutions for those. We are using I think Aisha mentioned, a lot of solar mechanized systems. We're also using water kiosks and water taps. So people would have it's almost like an ATM system, so people can use that to process their water so that they're not carrying cash around. And we're really trying to figure out how to best partner with the institutions that are on the ground leading these movements. So we've been doing that a lot, especially in the MER region in the Middle East. The work is ever evolving and ever changing. And I think that's why it's so important for us to have so many of our staff from the communities that they're serving and working in, because they do have that historical knowledge and awareness of the community from before the emergency arose, so they're better able to design programs that are more sustainable. I think one of the things that I find really inspiring to me is one of our lead engineers in Afghanistan is a woman. So she was our first woman engineer and has been inspiring other women to start taking a bigger role in our WASH leadership and some of the structural design components of our water programming. And so that's really exciting to see as well, because, you know, they're the people who have grown up through conflict or for a significant portion of their life through the conflict know the best systems to withstand continued turmoil. So yeah, we're constantly evolving and adapting. Yep.
Sorry, can you explain again? You mentioned a water system looks like an ATM.
Oh yeah, so this is a partnership with Grundfos. So they're a water pump engineering company, I believe based out of Germany. So I should confirm that before I say it. But and so what we're trying to do is figure out systemized systems. So I think in our prep call, Kate talked about how a lot of hand pumps aren't necessarily the most sustainable over a long period of time. You can travel to rural communities all around the world and see old hand pumps that are no longer working. Well, with these submersible pumps that Grundfos produces and provides, we're able to then use a solar powered system to pump that water up. And I wish I could pull up a picture real quick. And it looks like an ATM structure. And so the community members have what looks like an ATM card, like a debit card, and they can use that to access water. Because as I said, our water associations require a fee for water services, right? That builds, it builds more sustainable program, because if people are paying for their water, then they're also making an investment. They're not going to abuse the scarce water resources. They're not going to overutilize them. They're going to maintain the systems if they're paying for it. And then also those funds go back into revitalizing the systems. So instead of paying for cash, they're paying with like these debit card like systems through an ATM mechanism. And this is really important also for the security of women. One, for the security of water, and two, for the security of women, because you don't want women walking long distances with money. Or any distances with money. So one, they can keep the card, and that makes them less vulnerable. But then two, it also protects the water resources because they're less easy to vandalize, to tap into, for someone to leave a stream running. It's all mechanized so that people can pay for the amount of water they want. The system shoots out the amount of water that they want into their jerry can, and then the system shuts off. So it's just advancements in the way that water is being provided in different communities. And it's constantly evolving.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard about that project. It's really interesting. Aisha, do you want to comment? I know within Yemen, it's more internally displaced peoples, or people that have been forced out of their home for different reasons. Can you talk about the best way to get clean water access for people moving within Yemen?
So there are, again, the diversity of the needs and the diversity of the population make it very difficult to have one solution. So if we're talking about IDP camps, and as I said, there are 4 million people in IDP camps, water tanks right now with multiple faucets has been the way to get clean access for them to water. And then that's where our filters also come in, because it helps them then make sure that the water is clean. If you're talking about, for example, in Hodeida, and this is a settled population where the water needs desalination, then the system that we are providing, where it cleans but also desalinates. And the water system actually is very similar to what Caitlin described. We can also make it for payment. So there is a card that you can use, but we decided, because we're giving them to the hospitals, we're not going to make it for payment. We're going to do it free. But also because it's producing 3,000 gallons of water a day, we're placing them in 3 different hospitals. One is in an urban center, one in a rural center, one in a poverty-stricken area. And so we have made an agreement with these hospitals that the local population, the neighborhood population, would be able to access that water. So they will have that. The majority of people in Yemen who are settled actually right now truck water in. That's and that's again where they're trying to find ways. There've been an explosion of techniques to clean water, from chlorine tablets to to again water filters, and there are so many other ways. The easiest way for us, especially in the public health sector, because a lot of people cannot afford to buy these expensive ways. Even if they are $1, it's still expensive. People cannot buy a bar of soap. We resorted to using, at least for the larger particles, is a cloth that they use to pour the water through it. And this is especially important in relationship to dengue, is that's one way of cleaning the larvae and making sure that they are protected. So we're trying to not ask the population to do more than they can do and what's accessible. We're always thinking about what can they do, we can't make recommendations that are applicable or people cannot apply them.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It reminds me though too of your idea that teaching the next generation that water is precious and putting, a value and having people pay a small amount, or even if it's an NGO handing a card that has a payment on it, it's that exchange of value. So no, it's a really interesting concept. I have one last question, I think, for each of you. We have a few philanthropist funders on the call today in the audience. What would you say the role of funders are in the water crisis, in terms of, and specifically, you all have talked about amazing innovation going on. Do you think that there should be more funding put to innovation, or and this isn't government funding that I'm talking about, more private funding? Or do you think it should be more fundamental to community building, capacity building for the communities? Or where would you recommend in terms of kind of a funder thinking about their priorities of having to help with the larger water crisis? Anyone want to jump in? Caitlin, maybe I'll call on you first. And actually, we have one more question I might tag onto this since we're running short on time.
Yeah.
From Larry. COVID-19 has impacted impacted our ability to implement water projects in many countries. This has been made even worse in Ethiopia, where escalating ethnic violence further impacts the country. So do you have any suggestions on how to address this dual wash and peace process? And maybe Caitlin in particular, if World Vision is working in Ethiopia, we've been following that crisis of how, if you can think about that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. I have to admit that I'm not an expert on our Ethiopia program. I do know World Vision's worked in Ethiopia for decades and has been in partnership with the Ethiopian government to provide an enormous amount of water services in Ethiopia. And so I need to get more information, and I can provide that to you, Kristen, and then maybe you can distribute it to everyone else about the specific question about the ethnic conflict that we're seeing. But World Vision has survived in these countries, no matter the situations that have been going on, partially because of the local relationships that I'm mentioning and the buy-in from the local governments, the national governments, and the rural water committees for the communities that we serve. And so, regardless of what's going on in the country, we're able to continue working, we're able to continue serving and building. And I think that's a testament to the desire that, the communities have for clean water and that the governments have for their communities to receive clean water. And also just the track record of our work over these decades and the relationships that we've built. And so I think I need to get more information about that specific situation, but I do know we are still working in Ethiopia. Nothing has deterred us there. In terms of how to address the dual issue of WASH and the peace process, I mean, I think they go hand in hand. And I don't just think, I know this from, from research and from evidence. Water, you know, as we talk about water as a tool for peace building, it's not just a tool for peace building around the water crisis or water related conflict. It's a facilitator, or it's a tool that can be used to facilitate broader dialogue. So when we talk about water being used as a tool to unite Jordanian and Syrian community members, that goes beyond just that community. That's something that impacts multiple regions. I think Kate talked about Palestine, Israel, and Jordan working collaboratively around water resources. That dialogue enables a platform for countries to engage on other political issues as well, especially pertaining to the socioeconomic well-being of their communities. And so water is really just it can be the instigator for dialogue. When I was working in the Nile Basin, again, you saw countries that had very differing opinions on various economic or political issues that was causing tension and conflict between those countries. But water was the place where they could all unite. They all understood water scarcity is an issue that will impact their countries, their communities, and their productivity. And so it's really important for them to address that. So even if they disagree on other issues and there's violence or conflict regarding other political issues, states will usually dialogue around water. And we see that with basin organizations all around the world, that they're really this catalyzer to initiate dialogue on broader conflict issues. So for me, I always see water as like the entry point to the peace process, just because it is a unifier and it is sort of the common goal of every party, no matter what side you sit on politically or in terms of a conflict, no matter what actor you are. Kristen, I forget your first question though.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
That's actually a better answer, I would say. And we are running short on time, but Aisha, I wanted to direct this question to you a little bit, because as Caitlin said, World Vision has been really good at working with the governments, but you've also worked in Yemen almost despite the government there and been really effective at getting approval from the Yemenis government, but working with the people directly. So can you talk about that? And maybe that would be applicable to the situation in Ethiopia right now.
I actually was thinking exactly the same thing as I was reading the question. If you're working with local populations and you transfer skills to them, you really don't, COVID is not going to be, or lack of travel or lack of being there is not going to impact your work, because these people live in these communities. So, and that's the model we have used. We have two governments in Yemen, and then we have multiple international actors. So because we wanted to be neutral and not be associated with any of the governments, we decided to work directly with the community. So all our work is based on the community. The community, if we are working with an engineer in an area, that engineer gets the approval for us to do the work. They know who is who, and they know, which area that they need to, person they need to talk to. So I think I would suggest very much that we work with locals and make our projects. And Caitlin also talked a little bit about this, in which that it is the locals that need to lead these efforts. I mean, we provide guidance whenever it's needed, and we can brainstorm with them when they have problems. But if they are doing all the work, then lack of access for us doesn't mean lack of access for them. The other issue in terms of how water and the peace process, the way I think about it, again, and I'm looking at it from a public health perspective, if people have families that are healthy, if people have food on their table, if people don't have, the issues that I just mentioned that Yemen is facing, they are less likely to enlist in armies that are fighting. So that, for me, that's something that is very important. So we support a lot of education projects in Yemen because we don't want these kids not to, to stay home because their families cannot send them to school. So by doing that, we take away an incentive for these children to be, sent to the army or be recruited. So as either child soldiers and for girls as child brides. And I think, again, child brides, that's a violence against women. So for me, my definition of violence is not, again, it's not confrontation between two armies. Is anything that impacts a human body is violence is violence. So these are some of the issues that I think if we ensure that people have what they need. And when you work with actually locals, it costs a lot less than having to bring in an expert from overseas.
Right.
So you can do a lot more with the funds that you have and reach a lot more people.
Such good points. We are at time. It just, the summary that I'm hearing too is really thinking about water as a human right, and really thinking about that first, and thinking about how to supply that and working with local populations and having them lead on all of this. We are out of time. Thank you again to these speakers. I encourage everyone listening to check out their organizations, get involved, as they've said, do something local, speak out, get engaged, run a 6K or walk a 6K, all of that. So thank you so much for joining Global Washington today. And we'll be doing, as I said, events throughout the year, hopefully getting back in person, but for now, virtual. So have a good rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.